Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to continue with Chapter 7 of Why Race Matters. In the last video we discussed black on white SA and white on black and the disparity between those two, so if you missed it, I highly suggest you check it out. And we also discussed the black debate style. And now we're going to continue with movie theater behavior. Please like, share, and subscribe. I never say that. I know I'm supposed to. And comment, whether you like me or not. Positive comment, negative comment, it's all good. Also, one more thing before we get started, just a reminder, or in case you didn't see the last video, we were talking about Kantianism, and Kant, Immanuel Kant, is an ethicist. So basically, when you hear Kantianism, just think golden rule. If you're Kantian, then you do unto others as you would have done unto you. And if you're not Kantian, then you don't. And blacks are less Kantian. Kochman addresses race differences in Kantianism most directly in a section pregnantly entitled Doing Unto Others, which concerns balancing the impulse to express emotion, as in talking back to the screen during a movie, against the sensibilities of others, such as the rest of the audience. Whites have been taught that to act on behalf of their own feelings is unjustified if someone else's sensibilities might become offended as a result. Whites are not simply being altruistic in placing the sensibilities of others before their own feelings. Whites, after all, are others in other people's consideration, just as other people are others in theirs. The black social interaction rule grants individuals the right to claim consideration from others for their feelings. While sensibilities also have a moral claim on other people's consideration, feelings are seen to have a preemptive claim. Individuals must place their own feelings first, even if other people's sensibilities might become offended in the process. With the shift in focus from doing unto others to doing for oneself, blacks can also act as their feelings direct without subsequent guilt. That's why, if you address this issue in a movie theater, a black person will get mad at you for getting mad at them because they can't understand what you're mad about. They have the right to express their feelings. So you don't have a right to be upset about it. Here, the race difference in impulsiveness is immediately expressed as a difference in Kantianism. Baumeister, Smart, and Bodin, 1996, summarized the findings of several urban sociologists that attainment of status in modern youth gangs is, quote, essentially a matter of acting as if oneself is above the rules that apply to others, end quote. Since some tendency toward Kantianism is necessary for the survival of any society, there has doubtless been widespread selection for appreciating it. However, as Kantianism itself seems not to have been as strongly selected for among blacks, one expects that valuing Kantianism has also been selected for less strongly. This conclusion is consistent with the high self-esteem felt by blacks despite display of traits considered shameful by whites, such as regular brushes with the law. If blacks do value Kantianism less than whites, then, while in some respects whites may be perceived as better by black as well as white standards, a black, for instance, may trust whites more than other blacks, the overall ranking of the races by black standards may differ markedly from the white. There is certainly anecdotal evidence reinforced by media accounts that young black males who prize toughness and dominance within male hierarchies hold less aggressive whites in contempt. They basically think we're bitches because we don't fight over every little thing. We try to avoid conflict, so they think that we're pushovers. Whites may also be considered sexually uptight. Maybe promiscuity is good for blacks, but not for whites. Going back to chapter 6, I think. It can be good and bad at the same time, depending on what group you're part of. From a biological point of view, promiscuity could lead to success in one environment and failure in another environment. There is no reason to assume black criteria for personal goodness to coincide with white. This diversity is a reminder that any racial ranking is internal to a value system, not a consequence of the nature of things. But it must also be remembered that, since the criterion for superiority used by Caucasoids is the descriptive trait of Kantianism, group comparisons in this operational sense are factual issues, empirically decidable. If you can get someone to agree with you that a Kantian person, someone who does unto others as they would have done unto them, is a better person than someone who is not Kantian, then it can be proven factually that on average, whites are better than blacks. In Robert Nozick's language, there are dimensions of value, along which groups may differ. On the evidence, whites exceed blacks along dimensions that matter to whites. The average white differs from the average black in ways that whites care about, and, although possibly not to the same extent, blacks care about as well. So even though blacks might not care about the golden rule when it comes to dissing or talking in movie theaters, I'm sure they do care about it when it comes to unaliving. They don't want anyone to unalive them, so they don't unalive other people. They do grasp this concept, but it has to be taken to an extreme. Rankings are more commonly determined by a number of partially overlapping scales assigned various weights. On the other hand, summary judgments are possible when one person or group outscores another on all or most scales. There is no linear ordering of value by one number, as Gould prefers to put it, but since whites outscore blacks on the major dimension of Kantianism and the secondary factors of intelligence, self-restraint, and time preference, whites are superior overall by white standards. Maybe not by black standards, but what are black standards? I would love to hear how they would explain that on average they are better people. I don't think they could really even elucidate or elaborate on what exactly the black standard for morality is. Since racism is bad per se, and believing well-supported generalizations is not bad, this conclusion is not racist. There may be people who think whites are superior to blacks absolutely, and that belief may be racist, but it is not what most people have in mind when, perhaps only to themselves, they indulge in racial rankings. So obviously being black does not make you a bad person. And obviously being white does not make you a good person. And obviously, hopefully, there are many black people who are much better than many white people. I understand this. All racists understand this. We are talking about averages. We're talking about if there's 100 white people and 100 black people, who's going to build the better society on average? I'll read the last sentence again. There may be people who think whites superior to blacks absolutely, and that belief may be racist, but it is not what most people have in mind when, perhaps only to themselves, they indulge in racial rankings. When asked what they mean, whites cite specific disvalued traits that they believe blacks exhibit more frequently than whites, such as, quote, pilfering, careless work, reneging on debts and promises, end quote. Miller and Dreger, 1968. The belief that blacks steal and break promises more frequently than whites is a claim of fact, which is not racist if true, and believed on the basis of evidence. Should honesty and reliability be white criteria of personal moral stature, the claim that blacks are morally inferior to whites becomes operationalized, empirical, and, if supported by the evidence, not racist. Hyenas steal more than lions. Is that speciesist? Is it wrong to observe that fact of nature? No. Many people say blacks cannot be racist, no matter how strident their demands or their vilification of whites. The oddity is that this proposition is intuitively correct. Black racism seems oxymoronic. Yet, if demands for special treatment on the basis of one's own race and denunciations against other races do not count as racism, what does? The usual explanation for this double standard that whites have the power is unconvincing. None of the definitions of racism reviewed in Chapter 5, such as belief in biological differences, belief in racial superiority, or race-based judgment of individuals, include the ability to enforce one's views. In order to exist, says Hacker, racism must have, quote, an impact on the real world, end quote. which not only implies that Hitler was not anti-Semitic until he became chancellor, but is circular. An idea cannot include its enforcement, since there is then no way to specify what idea is to be enforced. Even Hacker admits problems here. It is also doubtful that running through people's minds is the idea that, since whites have power, all white criticism of blacks must be driven by the bad, and hence racist, desire to oppress, whereas all black criticism of whites is driven by a benign desire for equality. Many black tirades are far from benign. I suggest that those, particularly whites, who deny that blacks can be racist, do so for a quite different, forbidden reason. Such individuals do think of racism in one of its conventional senses, namely belief in racial superiority, and they find it inconceivable that anyone, black or white, can really believe that blacks are superior to whites. And they find this inconceivable because they are using Caucasoid criteria for personal worth, tacitly operationalizing the claim that blacks are better as the factual claim that blacks are more productive, cooperative, honest, and law-abiding. This factual claim seems too preposterous for anyone to maintain seriously. Since this reason for denying black racism is deeply taboo, a more acceptable black-white asymmetry must be substituted, and the black-white power asymmetry is handy. The simplest explanation of reluctance to call any black racist is that most people operationalize judgments of personal worth. The empirical character of racial comparison emerges, finally, in defenses of affirmative action like James Nichols in 1975, who justifies preference for all blacks as an administrative convenience. He admits that discrimination has not harmed all blacks, but argues that since any black is highly likely to have been victimized, there is a high correlation between being black and deserving preference. Race can therefore go proxy for victimhood without incurring unacceptable costs in injustice. But Nichols worries, momentarily, that racists will claim they discriminate against blacks because of a high correlation between being black and being lazy or untrustworthy. Nichols allows that laziness and untrustworthiness are good reasons to doubt someone will make a good employee, but replies that the affirmative action advocate differs from the racist because the racist, quote, has to make claims which can be proven to be erroneous about the correlation between being black and having some relevant defect, such as being lazy or untrustworthy, while the defender of racially administered preferential policies can make a plausible case without using erroneous premises. End quote. It's only racist when you do it, not when I do it. That's basically what he's saying. It's not racist to generalize about blacks when you're talking about their victimhood. It's only racist to generalize about blacks when you're talking about their negative traits. Nichols, then, hinges the distinction between preference and racism on the claim that blacks are as industrious and honest as whites. Independently of whether this is actually so, it is, as Nichols explicitly admits, an empirical claim. True or not true? Nichols is discussing good employees rather than good persons, but this more limited context nonetheless illustrates how readily questions of worth and correlation of worth with group membership reduce to questions about empirical criteria. Nichols freely allows that some forms of discrimination against blacks would be justified, and hence not racist, if the racist claim is empirically correct. So even anti-racists can admit that discrimination is justified if different groups have different traits, but they just can't bring themselves to admit that different groups have different traits. In light of Chapter 6, the race differences cataloged here are not most accurately described as differences in morality. By definition, morality is the domain of universal rules. Groups have different moralities when they universalize different rules. Differential interest in rules, per se, is not a difference in morality, but a difference in concern with morality itself. Blacks may therefore be said to be, on average, less interested than whites in morality, not more immoral, but more amoral. Blacks, like whites, have values, preference is revealed in behavior, but preference for conformity to the golden rule is not as strong an impulse for blacks as for whites. This does not make either whites or blacks better in any absolute sense. From a biological point of view, moral thinking, putting a premium on universalizable patterns of behavior, is an adaptation that is not better or worse than amorality. From a biological point of view, stealing might be the best way to survive. In some environments, what whites would call morality might actually make it harder to survive. So from a biological standpoint, it would be bad. Being the only honest person among a group of dishonest people could be a disadvantage. But being an honest person when you're surrounded by many honest people would be an advantage. See how this works? But from a Caucasoid point of view, moral thinking is better than amoral thinking. For that reason, whites who accept empirical race differences will find racial comparisons difficult to avoid. I would love to avoid making these judgments. I would love to pretend they don't exist, but I can't because there are consequences. I would love to not have idiots acting like I am morally deficient for being racist, for being aware of race differences. But oh well. Truth matters more than your opinion of me. Moving on. Efforts to avoid racial ranking. Many commentators seek to disrupt the racial ranking implicit in white values by minimizing or denying the differences between black and white attitudes. Of a group of black teenage murderers, the New York Times wrote, quote, "The most shocking thing about them is their ordinariness. Like so many young teenagers, they are insecure, materialistic, impressionable, not always in command of their anger and aggressiveness." End quote. A Newsweek story about illegitimate black children begins, quote, "Devonna Ruckett is 7, and at least outwardly she has all the trappings a kid could need. There's the hot bike, the cool clothes. What Devonna lacks is a live-in father. Born to a 16-year-old unwed mother without the financial and emotional resources to take care of her, hers is a family of women." End quote. The question this story does not ask is how Devonna's mother could afford that bicycle and those cool clothes. As Devonna and her mother live on welfare, the answer is with other people's money. Hacker, 1992, compares black unmarried mothers on welfare to widows receiving Social Security, and argues that welfare, but not Social Security, is criticized because, quote, "those receiving these Social Security benefits are overwhelmingly white." End quote. Seriously? This is not so. Critics of welfare would reply that the late husbands of surviving widows had contributed to the Social Security system, and moreover were helped to work and be productive by their wives' support in the home. The typical unmarried welfare mother has put nothing into the public treasury from which her welfare payments are drawn. How can you not see that difference? What the Hacker also forgets that Social Security has numerous white critics who worry that current claimants are receiving more from the system than they paid in, and regard the possible inequitable burdening of future generations as a moral and fiducial crisis. Blacks appear entirely untroubled by their disproportionate receipt of public funds. They don't ask, where this money coming from? They just care that they get it. Jenks goes farther in attempting to assimilate disparate value systems. He admits the willingness of most welfare recipients to lie and cheat. Quote, "Yet welfare mothers operate on the same moral principles as most other Americans. They believe that their first obligation is to care for their children, and they assume this means providing food, shelter, heat, electricity, furniture, clothing, and an occasional treat. Since the welfare system seldom gives mothers who follow its rules enough money to pay for such necessities, they feel entitled to break the rules." End quote. This caricatures the moral principles of other Americans. White mothers believe their first obligation is to care for their children through their own efforts and those of their husbands. White norms forbid a woman to have children until she has married a man able to support them. Whites find public assistance shameful. the average white would not be comfortable buying her children occasional treats with someone else's money, let alone feel entitled to do so, and would regard it as profoundly wrong to break rules she has agreed to obey to get money taken from others by a third party. This difference in attitudes probably illustrates the interaction of motivational and cognitive factors in morality. I think he's being a little charitable, to be honest, regarding the morality of white women. I think he's mistaking the morality of white men that is then enforced upon white women. Single white mothers probably don't have this high of a morality that he's describing, to be honest. But white women who are in a committed relationship with the father of their children, yeah, he's probably right about them, not wanting to abuse the system. This difference in attitudes probably illustrates the interaction of motivational and cognitive factors in morality. One reason an unmarried 17-year-old black mother whose IQ is 80 does not worry about the ethics of welfare is that she cannot comprehend where her welfare check comes from, or the workings of the political system that provides it. The version of the equivalency thesis implicit in calling black teenage murderers materialistic like so many teenagers is that black values merely exaggerate those borrowed from white society. According to Joan Countryman, 1994, quote, "The enthusiasm of poor black children, both for conspicuous consumption and for violence, suggests that inner-city residents aspire to embrace all the trappings of mainstream America." Shawntae Patterson, one of the most intelligent and attractive children in a study under discussion, became a drug dealer and later went to jail, largely because of the grinding memories and the delusion of psychic relief that his American upbringing has offered to him. To compensate for the hurt of growing up poor, jobless, and outcast, they have sought these essentially American dreams. End quote. Translation: white people like to have material goods, so black people rob, steal, and sell drugs in order to be like white people, so it's white people's fault. Nike, a manufacturer of running shoes popular with black teenagers, has been accused of inciting blacks to steal to get them by using the slogan, "Just do it," in its advertising. It hardly needs to be said that drug trafficking, killing, and stealing running shoes are not mainstream America or essentially American dreams. White teenagers are exposed to the same advertising and material goods, yet do not as frequently resort to violence when unable to afford them. Imagine stealing a pair of sneakers and then blaming Nike because their advertising said, "Just do it." Anecdotally, I would just like to say that I, at one point, was poor enough to live in an abandoned building for a year in New York, freezing my ass off in negative 20-degree weather. At no point did it cross my mind to sell drugs in order to improve my situation, because I thought about the golden rule, and I thought, do I want to be part of the cycle of addiction? Do I want my fortune to depend on others' misfortune? Now, am I tooting my own horn if I make the factual claim that this is higher level thinking? No. This is a higher level of morality. That's all there is to it. I'm not saying that I am a super moral person. I'm not. I eat animal products, just like every black person does. Animal products that came from abused animals, most likely, most of the time, or a large portion of the time. I try to avoid that, but it's very difficult. But still, I at least think about these things, at least consider how my actions are affecting other people or enabling the downfall of society. I think to myself, I want to act the way that I would want everyone else to act, and lower order morality people think, if I don't do it, someone else will, when it comes to drug dealing, for example. I think I'm not going to sell drugs because if no one did, then the world would be a better place. I want to act the way I wish everyone else acted. Continuing. In part, white values and black values may appear more similar than they are because in a non-behavioral sense, the races agree. Blacks surveyed will say they deplore crime and filth, and that they want jobs. Criminologist James Hagedorn reports that 2/3 of drug dealers he interviewed, quote, would like to settle down with their families in homes with white picket fences. They know that they are poisoning the community and believe it is morally wrong, but they don't feel they have an option." End quote. These words mean little, for values are revealed in behavior. Anyone who believes it is morally wrong to sell drugs does not sell drugs unless compelled to by a motive weightier than a lack of options. Whatever their words, blacks and whites differ in behavior relevant to morality. These differences are also obscured by the mistaken belief that people consciously set out to be good or bad. In real life, nobody follows the pronouncement of Richard III that, quote, "I am determined to be a villain," end quote. Moral judgments are passed externally on actions and motives that seldom have explicit moral content, and may, to the subject himself, seem legitimate. The neo-realist movies made by and about young blacks, such as New Jack City, Juice, Menace to Society, Boys in the Hood, Clockers, Dead Presidents, Set It Off, and New Jersey Drive, usually portray their protagonists sympathetically, as trying to overcome or falling victim to the ghetto or racism. To themselves, to the directors of the movies, and to the black audiences cheering them, these kids are not evil. Yet the mayhem they commit is, by white standards, evil. This reminds me of Breaking Bad, going back to what it said about how sometimes immoral things can seem legitimate if you can convince yourself, like, Walter White did, oh, I'm doing it for my family, so it's okay. But at least the message of that show, in the end, was, no, what you did was wrong, even if it was for your family. As far as I understand, the message of these movies is what you did was not wrong because you had a good reason. A simple experiment involving the prisoner's dilemma, see section 4.3, would go some way towards testing for the race differences in morality. Google prisoner's dilemma if you don't know what it is. Although non-cooperation is rational in a single prisoner's dilemma encounter, as we saw, cooperation is rational in the early stages of a long series of prisoner's dilemma plays, as a signal from one player to the other that he will cooperate if the other one does. However, players whose short-term desire for the defector's payoff overwhelms their desire for a future series of non-cooperative payoffs will nonetheless defect if offered cooperation. If you're not future-oriented, if you're not thinking about return customers or establishing a relationship of trust with someone, and you're just thinking, what can I get now? What can I get now? Then you're not going to be cooperative. You're not going to be moral. You're not going to be trustworthy. A person's tendency and ability to be future-oriented, to conceptualize the future, if I do this and then that, this, that, this, to think a few moves ahead, like in chess, these reflect not only a cognitive capacity, but a resulting level of what we would call morality. Short-sighted persons will also miss the advantages of future cooperation, hence not initiate a cooperative exchange. Here we see the intimate relation between time preference and intuitively moral behavior. This reminds me of when I was like 18 or 19 and I tried to buy some weed from this black guy and this Puerto Rican guy. And I thought that they were trustworthy. I was anti-racist at the time, I thought everyone's the same. So I thought that they were like me and that they would not want to screw me over because they would want repeat business and they would see that there's more of an advantage. They can make more money in the long term by having me as a repeat customer. So why would they screw me over? So I gave them some money without getting the product. I believed them that they were going to go get it and bring it back to me, and they just, screwed me over. I've never had that happen with a white person. Continuing. The hypothesis of race differences in morality presented here predicts race differences in the play of iterated prisoners' dilemmas. Whites, it is predicted, will be more apt than blacks to initiate cooperation, to respond cooperatively to cooperation, and occasionally to meet non-cooperation with cooperation. Economists and social scientists experienced in running prisoners' dilemma tournaments should find it easy to design a test of these predictions. I think we all know how that would go. I think we'll stop there. Next video will be about egalitarianism and what does it actually mean to be equal. Equal how? A lot of people like to just say that we're all equal, which is like the stupidest thing you could say, because there's so many dimensions to measure. Are we all equally the same height? Are we all equally the same weight? Are we all equally intelligent? Are we all equally athletic? Equally moral? What do you mean equal? So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. Peace.